Is there really anything left to report this week now that Taylor Swift has come and gone?
I'm so excited. I might faint, honestly.
We've dug deep and found 26 minutes worth of non-Taylor coverage.
We need to get Frank White out.
Anger over property assessments now spills out onto the streets, and didn't see that coming. The streetcar line screeches to a halt. The entire system shut down for 3 weeks. And it's the week of the Big Gun Summit in Kansas City. Missouri's big city mayor is pushing a new amendment to let cities decide their own gun laws. Plus, should the mayor make more money than the governor of Missouri or Kansas? The big pay raises on the way for Quinton Lucas and the rest of the council. Those stories and the rest of the week's news straight ahead.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of AARP Kansas City, RSM, Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, the restaurant at 1900, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome, I'm Nick Haynes. It is good to have you with us again on the program that connects the dots on the week's most impactful, confusing and befuddling local news stories. Tracking the news this week, KCUR's Lisa Rodriguez. From our Metro's newest newspaper, Next Page KC, Eric Wesson. Channel 9 political analyst Michael Mahoney and former Star reporter Dave Helling. Now, the big question of the week is there really anything left for us to report now that Taylor Swift has come and gone? Now, to be honest, I have never seen anything quite like it. Can you name another famous personality who's got this much attention for coming to Kansas City? I don't think, Eric, the president, if they were to come here, would get this type of attention.
No, I would probably rate this as the number one, even though Beyonce is getting ready to come, and that's going to be pretty wild too. But I would say right now, Taylor Swift and the Chiefs parade probably are the top two attendance events that we've had here in Kansas City.
Have you ever seen anything like that, though, in terms of that news coverage, Michael?
No, it was phenomenal, and it was wall to wall everywhere in town. And the one thing that we were talking about before the broadcast here was the economic impact of this was stunning. It was all over town, not just out at the sports complex, but these Swifties came into town and they brought their bank book with them.
Absolutely. You know, a number of business owners also, again, not only gushing about the amount of money they made from these Swifties, but they said they spent far more cash in their stores over the 2 days the singer was in town than when the NFL draft was in town.
It was the busiest, most fun, crazy, insane weekend we have ever had in the 4 years we've been open.
It was definitely a little over triple the amount that we normally do.
We met people from Norway, Georgia, Los Angeles. We prepared for the Super Bowl parades. We prepared for the draft. This more than doubled our weekend revenue.
That's a huge, stunning contrast when you were on this program, Lisa, right after the NFL draft, and all of those local business owners saying, never again. They got no business out of it.
Right. And to be fair, the NFL draft and the Taylor Swift concert were very different events. The draft, people were contained in a single area with pre-selected vendors. Here, as Michael was saying, Taylor Swift fans were everywhere. They were in Independence. They were in Overland Park. Driving around, you could see, because they were all dressed up and excited, where to go, and they were enjoying Kansas City's landmarks. And I think part of it is because this is such an experience, because the Eras Tour is such a big deal, people were looking for things to remember this experience by, and specifically the place they were in when they saw it.
Is there a lesson for Kansas City in this, Dave? After all, you know, it's cost millions for Kansas City to put on the NFL draft. We're going to be looking at $100 million at least in local and state dollars to put on the World Cup. You could just bring in a big singer and you don't have to pay anything.
Well, yeah, and let's face it, Taylor Swift was 10 times more entertaining than the NFL draft,
Okay.
which was paint drying on the wall. But there is an interesting lesson that I think the Chiefs and maybe the county will be thinking about, because one of the discussions now underway, of course, is putting a roof on Arrowhead Stadium, which would presumably make big-time concerts more possible, particularly in September, October, when it tends to get a bit more cool. And the reaction to Taylor Swift, 2 shows, remember, may convince some local people that turning Arrowhead into a potential venue for concerts is a good idea.
In other news, it feels like Groundhog Day in the Kansas City news business right now. We're reliving pretty much the same stories we did last week, the week before, and the week before that.
Groundhog Day! I'm reliving the same day over and over.
I get the feeling angrier homeowners now taking into the streets to express their discontent with Jackson County property appraisals. It's getting ugly out there while the county extended its appeal deadline. Some residents threatening to launch a recall campaign to oust County Executive Frank White from office.
We need to get Frank White out.
White says the county is just following the law. Are upset homeowners directing their anger, Eric, at the wrong person?
In a way, there is a couple of things that he might have been able to do differently, but the state law mandates what they do and how they do it. I think the extending the appeal time was a plus because people were having problems with that, even though people are still having problems with their appointments of coming down there to get their assessments appealed. But, you know, it's not really a whole lot he could do about it.
I'm interested in the recall aspect of this because we hear that all the time. People get upset with Quinton Lucas. There's been recall efforts of him in the last 2 years. Eric Bunch, the city councilman, recall efforts against him. They always seem to fizzle out. Is this a long shot to expect that people could oust a sitting county executive in Jackson County?
It would be difficult. Remember, we just had an election in 2022, and Frank White won relatively comfortably against his opponent. So recall, and plus there's no real indication that if you recalled Frank White that somehow the assessment debacle would go away or be solved. But it is a political problem to see these homeowners complain and have these concerns about their appraisal for their homes in the process, Nick. And so I think there will be a continuing effort to try and find some path to give some relief.
And Frank White's certainly been on the offensive. He does a full editorial in the Kansas City Star saying people are getting this all wrong. There's a lot of misinformation out there. They've now hired a public relations firm to clear up and debunk all of what they say is this misinformation that's being put out there. What is the biggest misinformation about the appraisal process, Michael?
I think that people think that there's some sort of vehicle that they can launch to rectify this and get their appraisals lowered substantially or capped at 15% or something like that. And then the other thing is, let's say for a moment that there is a successful recall effort, okay, and he is recalled. There's nothing that stops Frank White from being on the ballot once again to stand for re-election after the recall. And based on his re-election effort from just last year, he would be a pretty formidable opponent again.
You know, upset homeowners are coming up with a lot of their own ideas to explain why this is happening, by the way, with these eye-popping assessments. Here's one Waldo homeowner talking to Channel 9 this week.
It looks to me like they're screwing with the numbers. I think this is all about generating revenue to build a baseball stadium downtown.
Sure, he's not alone in thinking that, though, but is he on target or is he missing on that?
That one missed. The property taxes are not directly related to any effort to get a downtown baseball stadium, and in fact, a separate Jackson County tax would be the funding mechanism for that, which would be a sales tax, which we already pay. So there are a lot of stakeholders that do benefit from the property tax: schools, Kansas City, other taxing jurisdictions. But to connect the property tax issue at all with the downtown baseball stadium is wrong.
We had this was supposed to be the week we're going to have big fixes to this, including a freeze on the property tax rates for seniors, a second proposal, as was mentioned, about capping the increases to 15% for all Jackson County residents. Yet for all of that, nothing happened. Why?
Well, the legislature doesn't have the power to cap property taxes at 15%. The assessor has said to multiple outlets they have to assess based on property value. One thing that could be a long-term fix, and again, it's something the state would have to do and not legislature, is maybe extend the timeline. We reassess every 2 years. Perhaps if we assessed every 5 years, that would take care of some of these big market fluctuations that cause these big increases.
Yeah, Lisa's right that the idea that somehow this increase is leading to more money for a ballpark is probably way off the mark, but it points out something important, which is that the appraisal process is only part of the equation, Nick. The other part is what taxes are levied by the jurisdictions involved. If your appraisal goes up 20%, but everyone rolls back the levy 20%, the net effect is zero. So taxpayers who are angry about this need to pay attention to what the county does, the city does, and especially the school board in your neighborhood does in terms of levying those taxes to see if you can reduce what you have.
Because I saw
pay.
the 60% or
Right.
more goes to the school district, not to the county
And
at all.
just quickly, a couple of years ago when we went through this problem, I wrote a series of editorials calling on the Kansas City School Board to roll back its levy, at least partially, to not get the windfall, and they rejected that completely.
If you've got out-of-town guests visiting this week, don't add riding the streetcar to your fun things to do list. If you missed the news, the entire streetcar line has been shut down, and we're told it could be 3 weeks before service is restored. Apparently, a streetcar driver spotted a section of steel rail popping out of the ground on July the 4th while crossing the I-670 bridge. Now, you might think that would be a quick fix, Michael Mahoney, but 3 weeks, that could be done in a couple of days, right?
It could be done in a couple of days if that's all they were doing.
Okay.
But instead, they're going back and they're looking at all the track that is in that specific area, and they are also looking at a piece of track that was among the first pieces of track that were laid down when the streetcar was first implemented. And so they're doing kind of a soup to nuts look at this line to see what is there, what other problems they may be looking for or having to deal with in the future. But this is not something that is a good look for Kansas City or the streetcar authority.
But they do
right
have
now.
buses running along the route. They'll still stop. It might not be as seductive for your out-of-town visitors, but they'll still pick you up by bus.
They've patchworked, a way to get people from point A to point B. But I think Michael's right. This does raise a lot of questions. The track and the track slabs that were in place in this spot are the same track and slabs that are in place along the entire streetcar route. And this is, I'm on my soapbox here, but it really has me thinking: are we building infrastructure? I mean, July 4th was a hot day. It's certainly not going to be our only hot day, and the days are getting hotter. Are we building permanent infrastructure that will withstand more extreme heat? And are we planning for that in these extensions to the streetcar?
Well, we are doing that. So is it changing the way? Is it affected, actually, the construction? Has that come to a halt?
The Streetcar Authority's Executive President Tom Garand was on KCUR this week talking about this, and they said they are thinking about this type of stuff. He didn't say exactly how this has changed, if anything, ongoing construction, but he said it's on their mind as they build this.
I did see one change they're now looking to do, and that is to make, when the extended route comes into play in 2025 along Main Street, that it would be a strictly streetcar designated lanes.
People think that we'll just snap our fingers and close Main. Public Works in Kansas City has bitterly resisted closing streets before. They just don't like the idea of not letting cars in some places. And the business owners along Main, and that's a huge stretch of Main, are going to say, now wait a minute, the streetcar is fine, but prohibiting cars is going, so that's going to be a battle. The other thing is this incident kind of reinforces the idea that the streetcar is great but not essential, because they've closed the entire system for 3 weeks. It hasn't locked up. You can imagine closing the subway in New York for 3 weeks, or closing public transit in Chicago or other big cities. So it does suggest again that the streetcar is an efficient people mover and fun, but not essential to mass transit in Kansas City.
The mayors of Missouri's biggest cities gather in Kansas City this week for a major summit meeting on gun violence. Mayor Quinton Lucas called the group together as he faces growing pressure to address a rising tide of killings. The city marked its 100th homicide last week, putting it on track to record its deadliest year in history. Thursday's meeting, which included the mayor of St. Louis, focused on a proposed ballot measure that would ask voters to amend the Missouri Constitution to allow cities and counties to set their own gun laws. State law currently prohibits cities from taking any action to regulate firearms. It's interesting on this. Is this for November's ballot or next year's ballot?
I think it's for November 2024, and it's an interesting proposal, because so far we've seen for years the trend in the Missouri legislature would be, to remove gun restrictions, and really the only real threat to that power would be through a ballot initiative. Can it get the support it needs across the state? That's a question that we'll see playing out, but it's an interesting challenge.
So it's not going to be just Kansas City and St. Louis voters, for instance, voting on this. This would be the entire state, and so outside of those two cities, why would people want to do anything to restrict their Second Amendment rights, which people seem to hold so much dear in Missouri?
I think it will be problematic for this to get on the ballot, even to get enough signatures to do so, for the very reason that you just mentioned. And then the other thing, buried in a set of texts that came out from the mayor of St. Louis in the last few days, Tashara Jones, she remarked to one of her aides, she didn't think that the gun control measures at the local level may actually be working, and she cited the efforts in Chicago where it hasn't worked there, and they've got a violent crime problem as well.
Is this a political deflection by Quinton Lucas, Eric, that he can say, look, I tried to do something, but look, voters said no. I tried, it's their fault.
Yeah. You could look at it, because a measure like that, even if they got the signatures and got it on the ballot, it'd be dead on arrival, no pun intended, but it would, you got rural Missouri, they don't have the gun problems. You got cities that don't really have the problems that Kansas City and St. Louis had. So what's the point in doing it when you know you're going to be defeated? There are things that they can do locally for gun control that they might be able to work.
Garrett's right that it would be doomed, except that it's in November of 2024. That's a presidential election year. You've got a governor's race in Missouri. You'll have a Senate race, and abortion could be on the ballot in Missouri in November of 2024. That could alter the turnout in ways that could have some impact on some gun legislation or constitutional amendment if it gets on the ballot, which Mike rightly points out is going to be a bit problematic. But don't count it out if you had it in November of 2024.
I have to say this, one story surfaced last week that Mayor Lucas is now weighing a United States Senate run against Josh Hawley. Is that just idle gossip, or are there genuine efforts to get him into that race?
Well, there's always chatter about the mayor running for, Kansas City's mayor running for something else.
Okay.
But just quickly, if he ran and lost, he could still be mayor, but there are lots of Democrats in that race.
Now, one reason why Quinton Lucas may not want to run is that he now has a new baby to take care of. But in addition, he's about to make a whole lot more money. The council set this week to give the mayor a $20,000 raise. That's a 15% bump in pay. City council members would also see a more than $10,000 pay boost. That would mean the mayor would make more than the governor of Missouri and the governor of Kansas. Does Quinton Lucas have a more stressful and difficult job than Mike Parson and Laura Kelly, Eric?
With these homicides, he probably does. But what I found interesting about it was they were just having a meeting last week about not having enough money to pay 911 operators. You have all of these lawsuits that the city has to settle, which it's quite considerable amount of money, and now they're giving themselves raises. Really?
I did think it was interesting in the report on this that when the committee started hearing that earlier in the week, it said no one from the public commented on the proposal. Does that mean they don't care, or they didn't even know it was happening?
I think probably the latter. I think it wasn't really out there for people to know. It went through the Special Committee for Legal Review, which is not even kind of one of the big marquee committees there, although they do pass a lot of important legislation. So I think it's probably lack of awareness, but I think it's worth taxpayers knowing that this is how much their elected officials are being made. It is their money that's paying them. But this is also something that the council does periodically every 4 years. It's not surprising that this would be introduced now as a new council is set to be seated.
Well, yeah, just that point. This is going to be one of the last actions of this current city council that, in effect, ended their term on Thursday with their final meeting. So it was one more out the door.
Quick perspective, 15% sounds like a lot, but over 4 years, that's about a little less than 4% a year. That doesn't seem exorbitant for these positions. The mayor would make more than the governor, but I think less than the school superintendent in the Kansas City Public Schools, and still less than the police chief. So there's always a perspective involved here. They do it every 4 years. It's likely to pass.
And as of now, he will make less than Patrick Mahomes. Now, speaking of money,
he had a worse year than Patrick Mahomes.
All right, okay. It does seem there's a lot of cash to be made in green energy. Remember that $4 billion Panasonic electric vehicle battery plant now being built in Johnson County, according to the Star? It's now in line to gain $8 billion in taxpayer incentives when you add in all the local, state, and mostly federal subsidies now available. And remember the 4,000 good-paying jobs promised? The report claims the state's State's agreement with the company includes no commitments on hiring numbers or on minimum wage or salary ranges. While it may be raising eyebrows, the plant is now well on the way to being built. Other than to make people upset, is sharing these details now a case of too little too late, Lisa?
Likely, but I do think it is a lesson going back. The fact that all of these negotiations happened in secret, that nor the media nor the public were really in on these negotiations to know that there was any sort of guarantee of jobs. I think there was an assumption if all these jobs are coming and they're going to pay a certain rate, that must be codified somewhere, and it's not. And I think it's a real lesson in how you serve the public and how you leverage their money.
And I should point out the state incentives, about $800 million, did go through a Republican House in Kansas and a Republican Senate in Kansas.
And these federal credits are spread out over the entire country, so the impact on an individual Kansas taxpayer is relatively low. Having said that, I think the scrutiny that this plant was given before all of this was approved was pretty quick. I mean, they rammed it through in a big hurry. These stories will come out again and again. By the way, there was never, you remember when we did the airport, there was all the discussion about community benefits and set-asides and minority hiring. None of that on this plant, none of it. For construction jobs and for permanent jobs at the plant. Again, I think they pushed it through pretty quickly.
But there's nothing going to stop the plant being built.
No, I don't think there's anything going to stop it, nor do I think there's any attempt to take back or claw back any of the incentives awarded by the legislature.
Now, Jackson County lawmakers may not be able to solve the property assessment issue, but they did find agreement this week on what to do with those Andrew Jackson statues that some view as racially divisive. By a vote of 7-1, county lawmakers voted to approve a resolution putting the issue on the November 2024 ballot. Remember, that's when we'll be voting for president, when a lot of people will go to the polls. So could the outcome of the statue issue be different than in 2019 when Jackson County voters rejected their removal, Eric?
It depends on what Jackson County legislator you talk to. I talked to Manny earlier this week.
Who was the one who proposed it? He was on the show last week, Manny Abarca. Yes.
Abarca. And he seems to think that in this time frame they would be able to convince voters what a bad image that is, because not only did he own slaves, but what was done to Native Americans as well.
I thought there was an interesting twist to this week too, that they wanted to add language to say you're not just removing the statues, but in its place you would put a statue of Harry Truman. So in a sense, when you're voting, you're saying, God, you're dissing Harry Truman, our former president from our area?
No, I think having an alternative, taking down the statues is one thing, but taking down the statues and replacing them with Harry Truman, who is very much still the pride of independence and the pride of Missouri, does offer an alternative that perhaps voters would be more inclined to vote on something that has a next step attached.
The idea of having a Truman statue has a replacement, I think, has some appeal, but they already have a Truman statue at the Jackson County Courthouse in Independence. I think it's going to be, it might happen, but not going to be easy.
Just quickly, the other thing that would be a problem is the idea that we're voting on this again. I mean, I think voters are going to say, wait a minute, we just told you what we want to do, and now here you are presenting it again. That will anger a lot of people, and it's a bit of a slippery slope. I mean, the Republicans in Jeff City want to redo the Medicaid expansion vote. I mean, once you start saying, well, voters spoke, but we really don't like what they said, let's try it again, that can be problematic going forward.
When you put a program like this together every week, you can't get to every story grabbing the headlines. What was the big local story we missed? A judge sides with Chris Kobach and demands that Kansas suspend its policy of allowing gender changes to driver's licenses. A week after the Supreme Court outlaws affirmative action on college campuses, the Missouri Attorney General ordering universities in the state to immediately drop minority scholarships. It's putting the University of Missouri in a bind. Last year, MU and UMKC spent millions on scholarships to boost African American and Hispanic students. Should Sharice Davids be worried? The GOP leaning on diversity to win back the Kansas congressional seat as an Indian-born oncologist and LabCorp exec launches a campaign to unseat her. Was it the most watched show on Netflix this week? The new Mahomes series debuts, and the Royals may be having an excruciating season, but Salvador Perez makes it to the All-Star game in Seattle. He even scores a run. Taylor Swift wasn't the only big celeb in town this week. Music legend Dionne Warwick at 18th and Vine. She's just been inducted into the American Jazz Walk of Fame. Burt Bacharach also being honored by the Jazz Museum. The Kansas City-born composer and songwriter died earlier this year. Or was the biggest story of the week seeing Eric Wesson's face on the front page of the Kansas City Star under the title Newspaper War? They've now got wind that Eric has left the call and formed his own rival paper, Next Page KC. Hey, what was the reaction to that, Eric? I know that was your big story we missed.
That was my big story.
Did you get a lot of calls about it?
I got a lot of calls. We got a lot of subscriptions, people getting subscriptions, a lot of positive feedback. But one thing that I do want to say is I'm not at war with anybody. And I hope nobody's at war with me. And it's kind of disturbing that we go to that level. We have 3 Hispanic newspapers. Why can't it just be competition? Why does it have to be the term war?
Thank you. Lisa, the big story missed for you was blank.
I think we're still just in the beginning of this fight over gender markers on state IDs in Kansas. And we saw back and forth this week, but I think as more of these laws take effect, we've seen in different states legal battles over gender affirming care and these IDs, and I think that this will be a continuing developing story for the foreseeable future.
Crystal Quaid, who is a representative from Springfield, has announced a campaign for governor as a Democrat. It's a very long shot in Missouri, which is a very red state, but she is a very good candidate. She's well-spoken, knows the issues well, and the Republicans, who are now getting a bit of a crowded field in the governor's race, should not discount her ability going forward next year.
And Michael Mahoney.
Sort of related to that, Sharice Davids now has 3 Republican opponents. They're going to have a contested primary again over in the 3rd district in Kansas.
Should she be worried?
Well, yeah, she ought to be worried because it is Kansas, and whether or not that district is as blue or purple as Democrats believe, let's see how these folks do. All 3 of them are making their first run for public office.
And on that, we will say our week has been reviewed, courtesy of KCUR's Lisa Rodriguez and Channel 9's Michael Mahoney, Eric Wesson from Next Page KC, and former Star reporter Dave Helling, and I'm Nick Haynes from all of us here at Kansas City PBS. Be well, keep calm, and carry on.